professor in the English department in 2008. She comes from the Netherlands. She got her PhD. She teaches 20th century literature and culture, cultural studies, visual culture, critical theory, and gender and sexuality studies. She's the author of Elizabeth Bowen, A Reputation in Writing, and Lesbian Configurations, as well as numerous articles which she's published on feminist and queer theory, psychoanalysis, popular cultural, visual arts, and Anglo-American literature. She's currently working on a book entitled A Violent Embrace on visual arts and aesthetic experience in the post-period, post-representation. So instead of asking questions about the symbolic meaning or truth of a work of art, her research is focused on the actual work that a work of art or literature does in the world, and the way that art affects us, not just emotionally or cognitively, but also in our material embodied being. So I think what better theoretical reflection to follow a presentation that's been so very materially and physically based in our very context than the presentation that's titled Imaging Detroit, Between Surface and Depth. So let's welcome Renee Hoogland.
Okay, it will be very hard to match up with the upbeat talk we just had. But I think what I want to say about Imaging Detroit kind of links up with some of the issues that May has so beautifully raised. I also really totally envy your ability to speak fluently without any notes. I will actually read my paper because I'm not that good at that. So the first, okay, this works. My paper opens with a quote from Jacques Derrida. But skepticism is precisely what I've been talking to you about. The difference between believing and seeing, between believing one sees and seeing between catching a glimpse or not. Before doubt ever becomes a system, skepsis has to do with the eyes. The word refers to a visual perception, to the observation, vigilance, and attention of the gaze during an examination. One is on the lookout, one reflects upon what one sees, reflects what one sees by delaying the moment of conclusion. Keeping the thing in sight, one keeps looking on it, keeps on looking at it. The judgment depends on the hypothesis. And this is from his Memoirs of the Blind, The Self-Portrait and Other Ruins, published in 1993. In a previous version of this paper, in fact, in my first attempt to grapple with the visualization or alternatively with the imaging of Detroit, I took my cue from Time Inc.'s Assignment Detroit, the media conglomerate's year-long reporting project focusing on Detroit as an exemplary quote-unquote city in crisis, a project that ended on November 11, 2010, with a final blog installment entitled The Future of Detroit, How to Shrink a City. The project, despite some upbeat stories about lawn parties with the mayor, urban farming initiatives, and staunchly resilient urban dwellers, sustained and extended the most abiding impression of the city today, not only in the US, but around the world. That is to say, as Ming has already made clear, the visual imprint of its ruins, the horrifying pictures of its material disintegration. While Assignment Detroit and the Times reporters undoubtedly well-meant exhortations for the city to become quote-unquote smaller, greener and thriftier, appears a year later a rather stale, if not an old story, the interest in what has come to be known as ruin porn, a phrase that a recent Google search suggests is practically synonymous with Detroit, has by no means subsided. While Detroit, in the last 10 months or so, has become hot, which actually means cool, a cool hipster city in some sections of the mainstream media, the indignant blogs, rants, and more serious online rejections of its visual presence in these same media as ruin porn suggest a tension, an ambivalence, or perhaps an indissoluble contradiction inherent in the images and the imaging of Detroit. A tension that I would like to suggest is first and foremost a question of surface and depth, and hence, perhaps, primarily a question of aesthetics. I was forced to think about this question again when I was honored to chair a session at a recent conference here at Wayne State, a conference organized by the now almost defunct American Studies program under the banner Detroit Global City. The panel, entitled Getting Beyond Ruin Porn, the Politics and Aesthetics of Deindustrialization, clearly intended to denounce and get away indeed beyond the apparently insidious fascination of so-called outsiders with the all-pervasive visual representation of Detroit as no more than a bunch of burnt-out, half or wholly demolished buildings, with the images of what insiders prefer to call urban blight. Clearly, these two phrases do not refer to the same things. While the latter evokes the deterioration or collapse of Detroit as a modern industrial city and all the social, political, economic, and cultural consequences thereof in its concrete everyday reality, the former pertains to something that is decidedly real and concrete, but not material or everyday in the same way. Let me clarify what I mean by this by drawing a comparison between so-called regular porn and what's quite actually called ruin porn. Regular porn, as far as I can tell, concerns certain usual visual materials that serve the purpose of sexual arousal, but crucially at one or more removes. The last thing those of us who watch and enjoy porn want is to be in the room with the people performing the scenarios that excite us and be an active part of what they're doing. The essence of porn, in other words, is the pleasure derived from watching, from an encounter with a two-dimensional, nowadays usually a screen surface, without any real life or social depth. The same, I think, holds true for what is decried as ruin porn. Images cannot be expected to do the work of social critique. They may invite or incite people to initiate social action, to fight the blight, to combat the decay of Detroit in its geographical, economic, social, and material reality. But images as such cannot and cannot be expected to do that work. Where urban blight, in other words, evokes Detroit in depth, the phrase ruin porn cannot but pertain to a pictorial surface. The problem, of course, in the field of the visual, and especially when we're dealing with photographic images, is that the separation between the two is sometimes hard to make. The paradox of surface and depth that pervades the field of aesthetics more generally comes perhaps most poignantly to the fore in the imaging of Detroit, where the image functions at once indexically, that is to say, as a representation of the social material reality of urban blight, and no less compellingly, as an aesthetic surface with a distinct captivating power. It is the latter aspect of the imaging of Detroit that I wish to focus on here. While I do so, I will screen a series of images, not the by now all too familiar examples of ruin porn that have given the phenomenon its name, fame, and notoriety, but a selection of pictures from the forthcoming book by local documentary photographer Julia Reist-Taubman, whose work, in my view, powerfully captures the inescapable ambivalence of imaging Detroit, the paradox of surface and depth. And I hope this is going to work as well. My interest then in this paper primarily lies in the widely disseminated photographs of the by now infamous Detroit ruins in their irresistible beauty, as, on the one hand, markers of the irreversible loss of modernity and its founding premise of infinite progress, of the destruction and decay of a bygone industrial era of complex and ongoing racial and class struggles, and on the other, the operations of these photographs as images, that is to say, not so much as inscriptions or traces of a past reality, but rather, in the words of German philosopher Lambert Wiesing, as that, quote, which alone makes the artificial presence of things possible, presenting things as exclusively visible, released from the laws of physics. As such, the roofs of the ruins not only consist in their function and operation as rooms, whose significance at once lies in, but cannot be reduced to, the visualized objects themselves, but also, and as I will suggest more spectacularly, in their ubiquitous presentness as images, as instantiations of the phenomenon of pictoriality as such. The photographs of the city's ruins thus produce, in and of themselves, what I have elsewhere called Detroit's unreal estate in its pure visibility. Wiesing's theory of the image does not so much run against the commonly held belief that every picture tells a story. The artificial presence of things in and through images does not obviate the latter's function as signs. What it does do, however, is point out the difference between what we, following Husserl, might call the image carrier, the image object, and the image subject. In contrast to semiotic approaches to the image, Husserl's phenomenological perspective, not surprisingly, focuses on perception. His term for that which visibly appears in the image object, serves to mark off this aspect of the image, that is to say, the artificial presence of things, as distinct from both the depicting material, or the image carrier, and the image subject, the real or referential object of an image. In Wiesing's refreshingly straightforward terms, I quote, "The image object is not a real object. It is exclusively the object that is described when someone says what he or she thinks he or she sees on an image carrier." This decidedly anti-semiotic counter-concept of the depiction in the image, that is to say, not as a form or set of sense or content, but as a kind of object, entails that the image object should be conceived in terms of pure visibility, pure as in as the opposite of attached. Things in images are exclusively visible. They cannot be touched or smelled or heard or tasted, and hence are not connected to any substance that can be so perceived. Wiesing infers from this that, quote, "the implication of presence and substantiality dissolves in the image," unquote. And furthermore, that images can thus be understood as a medium, quote, "with which it becomes possible to produce a non-physical yet still visible object sui generis, even though this object is addressed differently as image object, imaginary thing, pure visibility, or false unity." On this phenomenological view, the question becomes whether images must always be representation and thus always refer to something else. Put slightly differently and more assertively, where a semiotic view assumes that images can and should be read, Husserl's notion of the image object suggests that when we look at an image, we are not reading but seeing, and that we are hence dealing with essential consciousness of the presentness of something that does not necessarily refer, that does not necessarily give meaning or content, that is pure visibility. Images, like everything else, can become signs, carriers of meaning, and tell stories requiring interpretation as well, but they do not have to. In its distinction from both the image carrier and the image subject, the anti-semiotic counter-concept of the image object points to a difference lodged in equivocation of the notion of the image per se, a difference that, in the case of photography, has often been articulated in terms of double exposure, to indicate the photograph's dual function as a document and its operation as a medium of artistic creation. The photographic visualization of Detroit brings the equivocation of the image strikingly to the fore. When addressed in their representational or referential function, it is the image subject in its relation to the image object, rather than the latter in relation to the image carrier that is at stake. In other words, it is the immaterial object of perception in its artificial presence that is called upon to tell its story about that which it is in and of itself not. The question then becomes, what are these objects, and what kind of skepticism is at play in the difference between believing and seeing, the ruins not only in their significatory function as rooms, each with its own magical significance, but also in their artificial presence as imaginary things, pure visibility or false unity. What is the nature of the glimpse that we catch or not of Detroit when we look at these images? And what would or could be the hypotheses upon which our judgment, aesthetic, ethical, political, or otherwise, of these infinitely reproduced images depends? Are the by now endlessly reproduced images of urban decay the work of, quote, vultures picking at the bones again, end quote, as Ron Williams, president of Third Wheel Mobile, a company whose mission it is, according to the website, to utilize emergent mobile technologies to promote a more healthy, just, and sustainable world, maintains. Williams follows a by now familiar argumentative trajectory in his denunciation of ruin porn. The photographers coming to Detroit, such as Edward Moore, are not considered to be sufficiently knowledgeable about the Motor City to produce quote-unquote authentic images of its streets, let alone of its people who are essentially abjected from Detroit's horrible beauty. The mainstream media coverage, according to Williams, is messed up, misses the fact that Detroit is the truth, that Detroit is the end result of a global economic system, the deadly consequence of capital freely moving across the planet, and the utter lack of vision and too often integrity on the part of the local business and political leadership. Williams' outrage about Detroit's decline is heartfelt, and his identification of its causes bears further discussion. But what kind of work are the images of the Detroit ruins supposed to be doing, or not to be doing, as the case here seems to be? If Detroit is the truth, how might its authenticity be captured in any image? In precisely that which, to recall Wiesing, alone makes the artificial presence of things possible, presenting things as exclusively visible, released from the laws of physics. If skepsis, as Derrida suggests, has to do with the eyes, and judgment of what one keeps looking at depends on the hypothesis. What does Williams believe to be seeing when he dismisses the mainstream visualization of the Detroit ruins for their lack of authenticity, their failure to capture Detroit as a truth? It appears to me that we must follow Derrida in order to begin to think about the function of these photographs through the equivocation at the heart of the image itself, and reflect what one sees by delaying the moment of conclusion. As image objects and as objects of perception, the Detroit ruins neatly fit into what Andreas Hewison calls the ruin craze, the contemporary obsession with the ruins in the countries of the northern transatlantic, which he submits hides nostalgia for an earlier age that had not yet lost its power to imagine other futures. Excuse me. Hewison thus situates the current nostalgia for ruins at the tail end of a history of ruin harking back to the Renaissance, for which, as Brian Dillon points out in a 6 issue of Cabinet, the ruin, quote, the ruin was first of all a legible remnant, a repository of written knowledge, end quote. In the 18th century, the ruin is an image both of natural disaster and of the catastrophe of human history, which Dillon immediately admits are hard to tell apart because it is precisely the simultaneously emerging aesthetics of the sublime that serves to name the confusion that comes over us with wholesale destruction, whether natural or man-made. Romanticism subsequently turns the ruin into a symbol of all artistic creation. The literary or painted fragment is more highly prized than the finished or unified work. In the 19th century, nature itself is imagined as already ruined, while the modern ruin, in Dillon's words, is, quote, always to some degree a palpable, all too real remnant of the future, end quote. Whereas he seems to follow Hewison in his reading of the contemporary ruin craze, Dillon takes the argument a step further by emphasizing that the ruin, quote, still with us after 6 centuries of obsession, is not a simple nostalgia for modernity, end quote. The endlessly reproducible and indeed endlessly reproduced images of industrial ruin, the vacant malls and abandoned theaters, the defunct railway stations, the silent foundries, the dilapidating bunkers and amputated subway stations disseminated across thousands of websites appearing in hundreds of lavishly produced art photography books, to him indicate, quote, a mourning of the loss of the aesthetic itself, end quote. Always tottering on the edge of a certain species of kitsch, contemporary ruins, he maintains, quote, show us again, just like the kitsch object, a world in which beauty or sublimity is sealed off, its derangement safely framed and endlessly repeatable, end quote. In their respective readings of post-industrial ruins, both Hewison and Dillon, whether unwittingly, intentionally, or conveniently, gloss over what I've earlier referred to with reference to Husserl, the serious equivocation at the heart of the image. That is to say, the fact that the difference between the image carrier and the image object is that one exists materially in the world and the other is a nothing, not part of the world, but an object for consciousness. How exactly an image carrier is able to produce in the viewer the consciousness of an image object presently presenting itself is, at least for the moment, inexplicable. The very fact that an image carrier is a physical object without significatory powers in and of itself is a necessary precondition for the image object in its artificial presence, in its visible only existence to come into appearance, and as such, may or may not, and in any case need not acquire its function as a sign, points out the indispensability of the image carrier, or in the alternative terms I've also used, of photography as a medium of artistic creation for the visible givenness of the image object, and its potential operation as a signifier. Whether read as a signifier of destruction and decay, of nostalgia and loss, or of the ruthless exploitation of an ulterior and displaced truth or reality, it remains the case that the image object can only presently present itself through the mediation of the image carrier, which brings about consciousness, or in Husserl's phenomenological terms, quote, it is the physical image that awakens the mental image, and this in turn presents something else, the subject, end quote. Rather than a nostalgia for a lost power to imagine possible futures, as Hewison would like us to believe, the images of the Detroit ruins, in their doubly exposing function as documents and as acts of artistic creation, do not so much, as Dillon in his turn suggests, operate, quote, as a means of mourning the loss of the aesthetic itself, end quote, but, on the contrary, I believe, raise the question of the aesthetic as an operational force. an aesthetic that is just as subject to history and thus just as political, ethical, and ideological as the history of ruins in which the contemporary craze with Detroit on real estate currently inscribes itself. A neo-aesthetics, perhaps, that insists on the kind of skepticism that Derrida introduces into his reflections upon self-portraits and other ruins. A skepticism that has to do with the eyes, with keeping the thing inside, while delaying the moment of conclusion. Our judgment will depend on the hypothesis. Thank you.
And here too, thank you so much, Renee. We have time for questions. So. Yes.
I'll start by asking, there are a couple of ways of asking, I think, the same question, which is the first is, why is ruin porn almost always photographic as opposed to moving, right? So these are still images, and there's something about, I think, the configuration of surface and depth that's particular to still photography that wouldn't, for example, be in play in terms of moving images. And so I was wondering if you could talk about maybe the difference in, I think, and it's ultimately a question of temporality, the punctuality of the photograph versus the duration. And you drew out at the beginning the difference between ruin porn and urban blight, at least at a certain level, looks like the difference between something punctual and something ongoing. And so I was wondering if, you know, the ways in which a moving image produces depth has to do precisely with its duration. So I was wondering if you could talk more about the temporality.
I think that's a good way of putting it. I think indeed it has to do with the still image. That's why I'm talking about the image indeed, and primarily in relation to photography and not the moving image, because the introduction or the kind of co-constitution of the moving image through duration, right? Because it's like it's not something that's being produced, but also goes into its making, really adds, I think, the dimension both of temporality and of spatiality. And this is why I kind of focus on surface and depth, because I think surface and depth, that phrase for me pertains both to temporality and to spatiality. So I think, you know, since they are inseparable anyways, right, space and time, so it's like, I think that movement also adds depth in a way that a still image cannot. But it's also the problem with the photographic image per se. It's so hard for us to think of, even though we know full well that there is no image in the world, in print anymore, a photographic image that has not been photoshopped in one way or another, or that could be totally digital, right? It's very hard for us to kind of let go of that idea that there's a reality behind it, right? From Bacht onwards in Camera Lucida to Susan Sondheim's, like the first kind of key or seminal books on photography. It's very hard for us to kind of let go of that idea that there's something real behind the image, which basically, and this is what my theoretical interest is, like it allows us to move beyond the surface, and it never really forces us to think about what does the surface do. Why do people get so upset? You know, everybody from out of town is like, oh God, Detroit is like horrible. I saw all these images, like, and everybody that I know who lives and works in Detroit is like always upset, but people who actually kind of have that response to Detroit and the kind of fascination, fear and fascination with the horror, you know, the horror, basically the horror scenario of the Detroit ruins. So what that set me kind of thinking about, like, how do these images produce such diverse responses in people? Is it because people kind of only kind of refer to what you call the image subject here, or is there something with the image object, what we actually see, not what we read, but what we see when we look at an image, that produces that kind of, that just interests me. But yeah, I think this is really very much, this argument really pertains to still images, precisely because we have this almost, it's almost like a compulsive belief in a reality behind.
That's a way of stating Bazin's effect, that like the reality effect is psychological.
Right, yeah.
And a sort of obligation to be credulous in front of the photograph.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I have to go off on that. So I think that 8 Mile is considered a movie of ruin porn too, in a way. And maybe you don't have the same kind of surface depth because you've got characters that are telling a story. There's conflict involved, that pulls you in. But, I mean, Detroiters still don't like that movie because it just shows the bad side of Detroit.
Right.
Despite, you know, our love of F&M. And,
which is also controversial, right?
Sure. And another example is the commercial for the Chrysler 300, which Detroiters love. When that, you know, Michigan State, where I'm from, has this group of advertising faculty who made the Super Bowl commercial.
Right.
So when they found how people responded to that commercial, people from Detroit loved it, and it didn't resonate with anybody else in the rest of the country.
Right.
Which was really interesting.
Right.
And I had a lunch with this guy who was a Marine who wanted to bring veterans money to Detroit, and he was telling me that when he saw that commercial, he gasped. He said, that commercial is heroin.
Right.
Because it brings this nostalgia that people really just want to, just refeed, rely on the auto industry instead of moving on.
Right. I think that we're dealing with very kind of different forms of imaging and visualization, and I think it's when I actually did that Google search. I didn't make it up, for the sake of the argument, but I did the Google search and just looking for the phrase ruin porn, and as I said, it's synonymous with Detroit. There's like no other city, even though we all know that there are lots of other cities that would be good candidates for this kind of framework. It's Detroit, right? It's the image of horror of Detroit. It's become this kind of prime example. But it's all the still images, because when people talk about 8 Mile, they look at the narrative, they look at the stories. And it's hard to it's harder to, and there's like definitely a good reason to kind of look into this as well. How does the addition of narrative, of language, of dialogue, of voiceover, of duration change the way in which the surface of the cinematic image works? Because that obviously is also, when you switch on the lights, it's gone, right? There's nothing there but in its visibility. At the same time, it works. But I think you will have to look at a different way at the visualization of Detroit because of the predominance in the way people remember movies. Even though they have images in their minds, they usually start telling you what the story was all about. So it's a different way in which it kind of phenomenologically impacts us. But yeah, it's kind of interesting because when I ask people, when I first moved here 5 years ago, and people said, so what's Detroit like? I said, have you seen 8 Mile? I was like, no, look at it. And it's like, oh, but that's the movie about Eminem. Most people do not really see Detroit all that much, but they see the story, which is like individualistic, which kind of totally fits into the ways in which we learn to appreciate and hear and read and interpret stories, right? It's this kind of lone person amidst like all kinds of obstacles who kind of finally succeeds. And most people just don't really look at Detroit all that much, who are not from Detroit or have no connection to Detroit. They just kind of see the Eminem story.
Okay, one more quick question? Yes.
I also think, what you're presenting today is actually a really important intervention into some popular narratives about how images work. But another thing, of course, I think that is an important aspect of the politics of attention about I think a key point is to think about who is the person who is producing the images, right? That the politics of photography is also, the lens is actually an extension of a body.
Yeah.
So it's an extension of, embodiment in some ways. And it's interesting to think about what images are seen or when an image becomes not porn, right? Visual porn,
Right.
We're porn because the narrative is also about who is taking the image, right? And that it's, in some ways, an image what's so fascinating about the aesthetics of these still images is that actually they can be read in any way, right?
Or
seen in any way, right? Exactly, seen in any way. But there is sort of an assumption that the person who's taking the photograph is supposed to have some accountability, or that the life history of the person who's taking the photograph somehow makes the image good or bad.
Right. Well, that's why I wanted to show Julie Kaufman's images because when she showed me the book or the images, I'm like, wow, this is exactly what I need for this kind of talk, because I've been using, you know, lots of the Henry Moore and the Marchand and the kind of like the endlessly reproduced. Everybody has seen them by now like a million times, and you don't even look at the image anymore because you immediately recognize it. What I like about this book is that and I took about, I think like 130 photos out of like, I selected from almost 270, so the book is actually, you know, it shows all kinds of faces of Detroit. So it's not just ruins, but of course there are ruins. I mean, everybody else, you show ruins. I mean, there are ruins in Detroit. There, like 1/3 of the city is empty. So you can't just kind of look around those empty spaces and just pretend that they're not there, right? They're there. But you also see the kind of beauty that people that I know who live and work in Detroit actually see in Detroit. And it's hard for outsiders to see that beauty. When I put photos up on Facebook, I have European friends who are like, oh, what an ugly city. It's like, really? So it's also something, the way you learn to look at things in like their three-dimensional appearance and in the two-dimensional. But I think it's hard to say because, you know, I call them products of our artistic creation. Of course, there is like, you know, a different way of looking at the ruins or looking at the city, having people in them or dogs or like life, as you also showed, makes a big difference for the way in which you perceive or anybody will perceive those images. At the same time, it is the image that does the work, because the moment, you know, the shutter clicks, it's beyond the control of the photographer. So even though there's always a moment of choice and selection, you know, what's your perspective, how do you print them, how do you cut them, how do you crop them, the image has to do its work. If the image doesn't do its work, and it will do its work beyond the control of the photographer, I'm sure. Otherwise, why would the photographer bother, right? It's almost like writing, you know, when you can, Bowen has a character in one of her novels, sit down behind her typewriter, this was before computers, sit down behind her typewriter, curious what it was about to tell her. And I think this is the way most of us write, but I think also most artists work to some extent within that kind of excitement and anticipation of something that's going to happen that is not fully within your control. But yeah, the choices are obviously also there.
Thank you.
I always go on and on.